Yeah, thanks so much everyone for coming. We're really excited to have our two wonderful guests today. Allie Pernina is one of our columnists. She's going to be moderating with Kate and Karen. And so thank you both so much for your time with us. And Joseph Haggerty with Spectrum UI is going to be giving a little presentation. And thank you so much to you all as well. So without further ado, we'll kick it off.
Lovely. Well, I'll try and keep this relatively short because I'm incredibly excited to hear from y'all two guests today, about DI, and for y'all as well. I know I've talked to like almost every single person here, so it's kind of cool to like see everyone kind of in one Zoom call that I've been meeting with and like have had connections with over the past couple of years. So I guess I'll kind of start with Spectrum's history. So that's a typo, but we were founded in October of 1970. And that makes us the longest, I wish, we'll be around until 2970, I'll tell you that much. But that makes us the longest running LGBT+ organization at a public university in the country. So that means that we may not have been the first at a private university. Columbia still beats us with that. But in terms of using like public tax dollars and in terms of being a public institution, we've been around since 1970 making noise. So we've had through several iterations of our name. We've had the Gay People's Union, which was like kind of in the beginning, as well as the Gay Liberation Front, which was adopted from what had been going on at the time. We originally, we also shifted to Glibtau, which was kind of like LGBTQ+ in terms of like including a bunch of identities within like the alphabet, but now we've kind of transitioned to going by spectrum to kind of recognize that with all identities, there is such an immense spectrum and that there's so many different ways for people to identify. It's like now we kind of realize that there are terms that come and go, and at the same time, we want to be inclusive to everyone within this organization to work for everyone. So one of my most favorite things about Spectrum can be seen kind of in that middle photo where that was at the anti-homecoming parade of 1970, resisting racism, classism, sexism, and most of all in this trying time, just a little bit after Stonewall, and as well as a couple other of the events that have kind of led up to the Gay Liberation Front. There was a protest and a parade in which everyone from the community, gay people from all backgrounds, were able to come together and basically protest the university not being able to provide them money and funding, as well as just the discrimination that was actively happening at the University of Iowa campus and throughout the nation as a whole. So nowadays, we kind of continue a lot of that with discussion of queer issues in our history. We have neglected conversations about our diverse culture that goes back decades, centuries, and even thousands of years that oftentimes are excluded from the history books. And so it's important to have those conversations. We host events. Of course, this year we've been all virtual, but there's been drag ball, alt prom, protest panels, etc. And along with kind of the two most important things are having conversations within the university on diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. So having meetings and representation, having student input for a variety of ways that the university is trying to better our campus, kind of at the forefront of what the Gay Liberation Front that many years ago were really founded upon, is making change within the community. And just community building, learning from one another, learning from people outside of the University of Iowa community, which hopefully is what this event will really be and what it will look like. And I'm incredibly excited for it. So just to kind of wrap up this quick little thing, if you're interested, May 6, 7 p.m. in the Iowa Theater, there's a bunch of our social media, but I don't want to take up any more of y'all's time just because I'm incredibly excited for what y'all have got to say.
Oh, thank you, Joseph. I think we're going to get started with questions for our guests now. So how this will work is first I'll start off with questions for both Kate and Karen, and then we have one question that's specific to like each individual speaker. So the first question is, why did you decide to pursue journalism, and what is a piece of work that you are proud of?
Karen, do you want to start? I see how you are, Kate. Okay, sure. Sure, I'll just start. So I will start, yes. I'll introduce myself really quickly. I don't want to assume you all even know who I am. So my name's Karen Hawkins. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the co-publisher and co-editor-in-chief of the Chicago Reader, which is an alternative, now bi-weekly in print newspaper. We turned 50 this year. We are part of the larger, of course, national tradition of alt weeklies like the Village Voice. Every major city, I think, and even a lot of small towns have alt papers. So that's what the Chicago Reader is. I am also the founder of Rebellious Magazine for Women, which is a small feminist site based here in Chicago. We're at rebelliousmagazine.com. We're all digital. We've been around for about 9 years now. And I am also a national board member for NLGJA, the Association of LGBTQ Journalists. I have to put in a plug that we are having our first ever student conference, June 25th to 26th. Registration is free for NLGJA members, or $25 if you're not a member, but we're so excited to be having it that all of the board members have volunteered to sponsor students to come to the conference. So it'll be free for you, however you want to do it. So June 25th and 26th, we have wonderful speakers, tons of opportunity to network. I've been a mentor on the student project at NLGJA conventions for about 15 years now. So I'm really excited about us having this opportunity for students to just gather themselves. So that's an introduction. I first knew I wanted to be a journalist probably in junior high. I got involved in journalism in high school. I went to a very bougie high school. We had a radio station and a newspaper, and I worked for both of those things. And for me, journalism blends like writing, which I love, reporting. I come from a long history of very, very, very nosy ladies. So being able to ask people questions for a living has really worked out well for me. And I think also the social justice angle of like really being able to use stories and storytelling and people's life experiences to change minds and to change the world and to change policy has also been really meaningful for me throughout my career. I'm going to think about a story I'm really proud of. I know I should have had one ready, but I'm going to hand it off to you.
Hi, thank you all so much for having me. I'm so delighted to be here with Karen, who I feel like I've followed for years, but never actually met. Yes, so my name is Kate Sassen. I use they, them pronouns. I am a non-binary trans reporter. And what do you need to know about me? Probably not that much. I got my start mostly by doing reporting in undergrad while traveling, and then really started reporting for the LGBTQ community at Windy City Times in Chicago. And I didn't really want to be an LGBTQ reporter. I just couldn't get a job anywhere else with the gay paper. And then the more that I started reporting on the LGBTQ community, the more I realized that being a trans person covering trans stories was actually really powerful. And so, what was the question? I'm supposed to tell you.
Yeah.
Well,
So the question is, why did you decide to pursue journalism?
why did I decide? Yes. Okay. So I actually when I also decided to pursue journalism when I was in junior high. We had to write an essay that was like, what do you want to do with your life? It was for a contest, and I had just learned about muckrakers and like social studies, and I thought that that was like a real career, and so I wrote an essay about how I'm going to be a muckraker. And I won this competition, and they were like, this is great. By the way, muckraker is not a real career. It's called an investigative journalist. You can do that. And I was like, cool. And so I pretty much pursued journalism like my whole life. I was editor-in-chief of my high school newspaper, and the administrators hated me because I wrote things about how like it should, if boys can wear, if girls can wear earrings, why can't boys? And like, I was always getting in trouble. And so, yeah, journalism to me has always felt like the best possible work that I could do with the skill sets that I have. I feel like when everything else fails, like you know, the government fails you, the courts fail you, like, you can just, you can go and write the story and just tell the truth, if you're good at it, and things might change, and that has always felt really nice. And you know, journalism historically is really fraught, right? It doesn't represent, um, you know, communities of color and queer people and poor and working class people, and I've always wanted to change that, but also the potential of journalism has always felt really exciting to me. So that's why I've wanted to do it. The piece I am most proud of, about 2 years ago, I started investigating where transgender prisoners are placed in state prisons, and found that out of more than 5,000 prisoners who are trans, just 15 were placed according to the gender that they identify. And I published a long form investigation with NBC News. We did a video component. It's the biggest piece I've ever done. Took me more than a year to investigate. And that's the piece I'm most proud of. Took a lot of work, and I feel like it had the most potential for change. So yeah, that's me. Thanks for having me.
And then the next question is, how does your identity as a journalist intersect with other identities that you have?
Thank you for asking. So I've been thinking about how to answer this question. So, because I feel like all of my identities intersect right now because I don't work for a mainstream news organization. So I'm allowed to bring all of that to work in a way that I didn't before. So the place where I worked the longest, I also worked for Windy City Times. That's something Kate and I have in common, right? Shout out to Windy City. I work for the founder of Windy City right now at the Reader. We're both at the Chicago Reader, Tracy Baim, who I would also recommend as a speaker for this series if y'all are going to continue it. So now I can't, I see I went off on this tangent and I forgot the question. So don't make fun of me, Kate. Oh my God. How my identities intersect. Yes. Okay. So I feel like I have the luxury of bringing my whole self to work. And I feel like my best answer how that intersects with my journalism is that I feel like I use my life experience and my perspective as an asset, as a writer, as an editor, and as a leader in a newsroom. And I run a feminist publication. I am a feminist, so I am able to bring my perspective and what is important to me to that work. And at the Reader, it means that I am able, honestly, to give sources and my reporters confidence that their pieces are going to be edited by someone who understands what they're saying. I feel like, you know, as we've said, like, as you said, Kate, like, journalism is very fraught and has a very fraught history. The Reader is not immune to that. I am the first person of color in the Reader's 50-year history to be a leader. And so I think people of color and people in different communities across Chicago haven't always trusted the Reader with their stories. And I feel like one of the things I bring is like that confidence that I'm gonna be able to understand that story and make sure that that story is told in a culturally competent way.
Yeah, I love that answer. And I think that for me, you know, so I'm, as I've mentioned, non-binary, trans, and I'm also white, and I do a lot of stories on trans community. And for a long time, for most of my career, I think that the belief was that being a queer person or a trans person covering LGBTQ stories was like a non-starter in mainstream media because you were biased about the stories you were covering, because like the, you know, the white cis hetero perspective was like the norm. And that has substantially changed, right? Like newsrooms actually want people from the communities that they're covering because they know that you have better access, that you understand the issues with more nuance, that people are more likely to talk to you, and that you're going to be more informed. And so that has really changed. And the stories that I'm covering a lot of times when I'm talking about the most impact in my community, like, are not the realities that I'm living, right? Like, I am a white, masculine, trans person, and I'm reporting on violence against Black trans women. And so it's really important for me to constantly be educating myself. Um, and also to be working to change who gets to do these stories. In terms of, like, I would love to be obsolete in this field at a certain point. I'm one of just a handful of hard news trans reporters in the field, and we need more queer reporters. We need more trans reporters. And so it's really amazing to me to be able to get to do this work in the mainstream, to be able to get to draw a line and say, look, this is our humanity that we're talking about, and we don't make a distinction, right? Like, when we're talking about anti-trans bills, I'm not going to quote someone who's going to say something that's anti-LGBTQ. Like, we just don't. I'm not subjecting readers to that anymore. And then at the same time, like, I know that that we're not there. We're not doing enough, and that I need to do better and learn more. And so that's kind of how I think about that and navigate that, and trying to make space.
Yeah, and then Kate, I think you kind of started talking about this with your response to the previous question, but the last question for both of you is, how do you approach interviews while identity is important? And what are some best practices when reporting on LGBTQ issues?
Thank you again for that one. And I'm having to go back in my brain because I haven't been a reporter for a while. I was a reporter for the Associated Press for 6.5 years, but that's been a minute. I feel like my answer will kind of depends on what news organization I'm talking about. I have done reporting for the Reader, and I feel like my answer for the Reader is that, as you said, as I touched on, like, really seeing my perspective and my life experience as an asset and bringing the nuance that Kate talked about, like really asking questions of my sources from my perspective, not from that like cis white moneyed well-educated man. Like, that lens, that gaze is obsolete to me. And so being able to ask questions from my own perspective. And I think in terms of best practices, like really using your life experience and your knowledge and your passion as an asset and asking questions, while also, of course, keeping your audience in mind. Like, who are you talking to, and making it digestible for those folks, but not talking down to those folks and not disrespecting them and not othering your sources at the same time. Like, really being able to be the translator between your sources and your audience, I feel like is something I really try to think about.
Yeah, I love that, and I always second all of that. And I would also say, I think historically we've privileged certain types of sources over others, and when we do LGBTQ reporting, or really, and I would say this of any kind of reporting, there's a leveling that needs to happen, right? Which is that we have to step back and understand, like, you know, the police or officials or you know, even people's families are not necessarily going to be the best source of information. So the example that I'm going to use, which I don't love because it's a sad bad story and I want us to have good stories, but I think it illustrates it, is like when you cover a trans homicide, for example, like the police are more likely to dead name an individual or misgender an individual. They're not going to be your first source of the best information, right? And same thing with that person's family. That person, their next of kin, may not be the person who's going to give you the best information. The person might actually be that person's chosen family, right? And so but if we're thinking about the way that we're taught to do journalism, and like the way that we're taught to like go to sources and where we get our information, like there's always this strange hierarchy. of, oh, if you have a quote from the police and then you have a quote from the family, like you're good. And we know when we do LGBTQ reporting and speaking truth to power, like we actually turn that on its head. And that's not just for like a homicide or, a hate crime or something bad. Like it can be something good, like that that we as queer people like really get to own our experiences and state who we are, and in order to do that we have to reconceptualize who gets to speak and the power of that, and not always privilege people that we think we should be hearing from, and that's one thing that I have had to do unlearning from, because I think for me I didn't always have the confidence to say like, no, this is the source, right? Like this is who the truth is going to come from, and to go to bat with an editor on that or a publication on that and say, no, I know that this is like what the best practice is, and to learn that.
So now we have some questions tailored to your own individual roles in the industry. I can start with Kate first. So Kate, how has the 19th News reported on transgender bills that are being introduced?
I'm actually really proud of this. So the 19th, for folks who don't know, is a nonprofit independent newsroom that reports on the intersection of politics, policy, and gender. And so because it's a nonprofit, basically anyone can pick up a 19th story and republish it, like ProPublica. Most of our stories get picked up by USA Today and all of its newspapers. So there's really wide distribution. So when the 19th makes a decision to, a stylistic decision, that has huge reverberations throughout journalism, right? So like, if I go to my editor and I'm like, I want to change like the way we do the LGBTQ acronym, like there's a good chance that like a lot of media is going to do that. Like, and it's kind of fantastic, right? And so we just drew a really hard line that about the way that we talked about these bills as being, anti-trans, as being discriminatory, and just holding up the humanity of transgender kids, and stating really clearly that they went against all of the science that exists. And there's nothing really controversial about that, but the way that media has framed this debate over and over again is sort of a both sides journalism, right? That like conservatives feel and like, progressives feel, and we're just gonna, and that's not really the case. Like the majority of Americans support trans kids. Like there's polling, but we just reported on it in a really straightforward way and didn't entertain this idea that trans people are not people. And our editors have really gone to bat on that, and we've reported that. And I feel like the conversation in media has dramatically shifted. And I'm not saying that the 19th did that. I feel like reporters are really starting to draw that line. But I'm really proud that the 19th has just been like very much willing to do that and to go there and to do different kinds of stories than what I think we've historically seen in media about the way we talk about trans people as other or different or strange, and just say, no, what is strange is like the way that these bills are being pushed.
Then Karen, how can you create an environment in a management role in news that is welcoming to LGBTQ identity?
And I don't mean to sound smart alecky with this, but the first thing I think is just to be out in the newsroom if you feel comfortable, like, just like being visible. Representation, as y'all all know, representation matters a ton and visibility matters a ton. And I don't want to force anybody to be out in a way that isn't comfortable or authentic to them. But I think it is really important as much as we can to like just front that, and to be very out. And I think the other thing is I I feel like I take a step back when I think about managing people, and I just try to create an environment where people know that I consider them people. Like, yes, you're a reporter, yes, you're whatever role you are, but you are also a human being with a whole life outside of the newsroom and a whole life experience outside of the newsroom. And I just really try to have people prioritize themselves, which is also a luxury in a biweekly in print, right? Like at the AP, we did not get treated as people, and I understand the story has to come out, we have to do write-throughs and all these things. I have the luxury of being like, if the news is stressing you out and you need to step away, step away. Like if you can't today, don't today. So I feel like that is like one huge part of making people feel valued as people and appreciated as people. And if you can do that, then people feel more comfortable bringing more of themselves to the newsroom and bringing more of themselves to their work. And so I think you can't start with I feel like my endpoint is obviously that people can bring their whole selves to work. But I feel like I started way back with like, I'm going to treat you as a human being first. I think that's.
So we're now gonna open it up to questions from the audience. If you guys have a question, you can type it into the chat or raise your hand in the reactions. Josie, go ahead, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could tell us more about your reporting, Kate, on the transgender women being incarcerated as men, and like how you came to find that story and how like that reporting process, what that reporting process was like.
Yeah. So that story actually, it came to me because I was reporting on basically the worst prison abuse case I had ever read about. There was a woman named Lindsay Saunders Velez who was incarcerated in Colorado, who's mentioned in that story. And um, her attorney was a woman named Paula Grayson who had brought the Masterpiece Cake Shop case to the Supreme Court. And I was talking to Paula very regularly about this case, and she had mentioned to me, you know, Colorado has never housed a trans woman with women, and I was like pretty astonished by that. But I also, in my brain, had done enough coverage of trans people who are incarcerated to know that that sounded about right. And I was like, yeah, that. And I was like, wow, that's a story. And she was like, well, honestly, she said, if you FOIA'd every Department of Corrections in the country, you would find that to be the case. And I was like, I'm going to FOIA every Department of Corrections in the country. Because the Prison Rape Elimination Act, right, said that you have to house transgender people on a case-by-case basis according to where they'll be safest. It was supposed to be watershed for transgender people. This was the law, that you were supposed to house trans people where they'll be safest, and trans women are not safest with men. And so I was like, that's wild. I got laid off soon after I decided to do that story, and so I wasn't working for anyone. I was just like sitting in a co-working space, like twiddling my thumbs. And so I was like, well, I guess I'll file some FOIAs. And I started getting them back, and sure enough, like no one was housing trans people appropriately. And I figured, well, someone's gonna take this, I'll just keep going. And I did. And yeah, sure enough, like there was a story there. And then I pitched it to NBC, and they picked it up. And the other piece of that, a lot of people are like, how did you get into prison? I went to California at some point, and I was like, hey, I'm like very interested in how you all house trans people, because California is always the most progressive. So I bet you're doing this right. And like, can you just tell me how you're doing it? And they're like, sure, come on in. And I was like, cool. And they let me in. And of course, they weren't like, no one has really done it in a way that is like no one had figured it out. So what we found was like not not good, right? But they were very eager to like engage with us and like talk through this, and very generous in terms of like letting us come into. They let me into San Quentin, and then they let me into Chino, and let us bring cameras, and
I have a follow-up question to your story if no one has any questions. When you went to California, did you like say that you were a journalist and you were working on this for like a story for NBC? I was just curious.
Yeah, I always disclose that I'm a reporter, and yeah, and where I'm looking, and yeah, they brought us in as reporters.
Did they think that you were going to be doing like a positive story? Like, did they realize that you're going to be, I'm just curious because, yeah, you said that there might have been access issues, but.
So I did two stories in the course of these like 2 years that I was working on this. The first actually was a positive story. I went to San Quentin and found that they had a group that was like a kind of like a restorative justice group, that the prison wasn't itself putting on, but was done by like an outside advocate, wherein they had people who had been sort of like convicted of hate crimes or had anti-LGBTQ bias in their past, meeting with people, yeah, there it is, who were LGBTQ, and together they were learning like all about LGBTQ issues and advocating together. Someone who had come out of that group had been convicted of like a double homicide of like, he killed someone who was a lesbian, and now like is a huge advocate for restorative justice. And so people who were like, I like hated queer people, are sitting next to trans women, like, and they're talking through LGBTQ issues and learning together. And I just was like, this is like what the whole world needs, and it's happening at San Quentin in prison. And so I did do that story, right? And I didn't come in there with an agenda. And I told them that. I said, like, I'm here to humanize trans people, and like that's it. But no, I didn't promise them a positive piece. And I asked them really, really difficult questions over and over again over the course of a year. And they were just really good about letting us in. I do think that they thought they had done a better job than other states in terms of like trans issues. So maybe they were more confident, but the story that we did, I felt like was honest and fair and gave them a lot of room to talk.
I feel like Josie, I don't see them on right now, but I feel like they had a question. Hi, Josie.
Hi. Hello. First of all, thanks for talking to us. You're both just really inspiring. But I guess as the majority of us in here are young journalists, what ways can we continue to better our coverage of LGBTQ communities, and maybe what stories aren't being told right now?
All right, I'll go. Bettering. So the first part of the question was, how do you, do improve your coverage? I think part of it is to make sure you get a diversity of voices. I think people, even now, and maybe this is better among young people, but I feel like my generation has a very specific notion of who you're talking about when you talk about the queer community. They're picturing like the handsome cis white gay man, right? And that's not who we are at all anymore, obviously. We've never just been that, but that now more folks are being visible and are making their voices heard. And so when you're writing about the community, being aware that the community is a million different communities, and that as a shorthand, we agree to be referred to as a community, but that there are so many different perspectives on things. And in terms of what's not being covered, I really do still think we're not great at talking about intersections. Like, my perspective is informed by all of the things I am, that I'm a cis woman, that I'm a lesbian, that I'm a journalist, that I'm a feminist, that I'm Black and grew up on the South Side and all those things, right? So I feel like we're not great at, like, because the news is so immediate and because of deadlines, I feel like we use that as a crutch to not be nuanced and to, be formulaic in how we talk about things, and to use boilerplate language that's like not at all really accurate for a lot of people. So I think, that's how I would answer.
Yeah, that's great. I'm curious that you talk about boilerplate language, like to refer to different communities. Do you have an example that you're thinking of off the top of your head of like boilerplate language to either avoid or like things to keep in mind as you're trying to be specific?
Yeah, such a good question. I mean, the one that pops into my head is not specific to the LGBTQ community, but inner city. I know what you mean by that. Just say what you mean, right? Like, we all know what the inner city means, right? Like, that's the one that I find like the most egregious. But I feel like, you end up picking up just language, just like Kate's talking about, like really getting the industry to shift how we even refer to the community, like that kind of thing. Like, are you picking up language from a previous story that doesn't align to where you're trying to be right now? And I think another thing I'll just say about style, like that I was thinking of, Kate, when you were talking about like not taking the police and the families, not making them your main sources, I would say also, I love that. And I would also say, like, push against the style guide of your organization. Ask people how they want to be identified. And don't just be like, oh, I'm sorry that's disrespectful to you, but my boss in the style guide said that's how I have to refer to you. So who am I? Like, right? Like, I feel like the reader, we have a style guide, but I feel like I have really tried to tell people, like, to not weaponize it. Like, don't just like hold it up as some kind of shield that you don't have to be respectful to people. Like, just really interrogate it and ask people how they want to be identified. And, we have a source in a story from a couple of years ago whose pronouns are Billy. Okay. Your pronouns are Billy, let's just go with it, right? Like, so I feel like just having an expansive notion of how you identify people, and don't just like hold up your style guide. Like, your style guide is meant to evolve, and don't just like get so stuck on it that it makes you disrespectful to people.
I love that.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's really helpful. And I remember we used to have a copy editor who was like from a different generation and pushed back on like uses of they them in a singular sense. And so that was always like a conversation that was going on that we don't really have, we obviously use that now, but it is, always like a continuing conversation of like what kind of language to use. Yeah. So thank you for sharing. Does anybody else have any other questions?
I actually have a question for y'all. I'm curious about if no one else has a question. I'm just curious about like what it's like covering these issues now as a student news organization. I know what my experience was like 25 years ago, but I'm just curious, like, what are some of the issues that y'all are facing other than the they them issue with your copy editor?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. Well, I don't mean to put her on the spot, but one of our politics reporters, Natalie Dunlap, did a big piece about transgender bills being introduced into the Iowa legislature. There's just been a ton of bills attacking transgender youth and all across the country, but especially like in Iowa. So Natalie did a story on that, and and Joseph, I don't know if you want to talk about things that you all are facing as well. Feel free. I know we've used Joseph, or we've spoken with Joseph for a number of our articles. So if you see Daily Iowan, you'll see Joseph a lot.
Yeah, no, I think it's always interesting just going back to the idea of like having like some form of representation, how that's constantly changing, because like I remember I talked previously about how my high school in Idaho didn't even allow for any LGBT plus organization to exist because there was tremendous outcry. None of the teachers wanted to support it at all, because not only were they nervous of like, not only were they themselves being discriminatory, but they were nervous of what would happen in their community. Like what would supporting a GSA do? And so I feel like it was really interesting coming to Idaho or coming to Iowa and then joining Spectrum and seeing so many people and then realizing, whoa, I'm just a white man in all of this. Like I thought that there was that, but then all of a sudden it's just so interesting to see how this like every perspective change depending on where you're in. And so it's really interesting to kind of always have that where I'm like, okay, I want to make sure that like, not only am I like telling it how I think, but also like making sure that other people have a voice. And I think that's the sole point. And even though I'm like, maybe I'll go into environmental journalism, probably not. We'll just see what happens. But I think definitely, I just think it's interesting. And I guess to kind of like end this with the question that's kind of been on the back of my mind, but it's kind of been already addressed, just like what has it been just in the past couple years, 5 years or so within like, whether it be publishing or whether it be in like journalism, what have like the major trends been and where do you see them going in the future in terms of how we cover LGBTQ plus stories?
I think that that's an interesting question. I think that we are seeing a major shift right now in the way we cover LGBTQ plus stories, in that you know, I think I mentioned this before, but you know, it used to be acceptable to quote anti-LGBTQ folks as like experts, and I don't think we're gonna see that anymore. I think that I think that we will report on those efforts to like roll back LGBTQ rights, but it won't be acceptable to quote homophobes like as like legitimate sources, just like we wouldn't quote people who are racist as like a legitimate statement. It's just like a weird thing to do. And then I'm hoping that we'll get into like a more nuanced conversation about the disparities facing LGBTQ people, and also just some more complicated stories about our community, right? We don't really we've talked so much about transgender kids and these bills, and like literally have not met trans kids in these stories. Like and part of the reason for that is because trans kids who are out in media face such intense backlash, harassment, and abuse once they are sort of named publicly. But the problem with that is like, if you talk to most people who experience these stories, like we don't know what trans kids look like or sound like or do. We can't picture this problem and who is impacted. Like it's just like, and so I'm hoping that as we talk about these like issues, we're going to start to see real stories, and I think that will be the trend as it becomes safer and less socially acceptable to engage in this kind of fodder. And I think it will, because I think that the federal government is going to put a damper on this, and I think that these bills will fail. I think that we're seeing a backlash to a moment, And so, yeah, I think there will be a greater diversity of the kinds of narratives that we have and more nuanced storytelling. And my other hope is that we will start to see stories that humanize trans people who are incarcerated or engaged in sex work, and start to understand why folks live at those margins, and understand like structural inequities um, that push LGBTQ people into scenarios where in the past, I think the reporting has been really unforgiving and really simplistic. So I hope that answered that.
I'll just add one. I mean, that was amazing answer. I'll just add, I always am heartened when I see stories about the LGBTQ plus community that aren't in June and that aren't about what some terrible thing that's going on with us, right? Like I'm always happy, like, oh, a happy gay story. And it's the same way I feel about like a happy story about Black people. What? Oh my God, we exist outside of crime? Who knew? Right. So I hope we continue that. And I will also say I am also heartened, and I hope to see more of normalizing our relationships. Like I always love when I see an openly gay person quoted in a story about physics or some random thing, right? And it just like as an offhand thing is just like so-and-so's wife, like, oh, okay, right? Like I hope that we get to the place where we just like completely normalize all of the things about our lives as a matter of course in journalism.
Yeah, thank you. Those are awesome answers and they're really, really, really insightful. To your question, Karen, earlier, one other thing that we've been stressing too this year is like making sure that identity, like, you know, if somebody is LGBTQ and it's not necessary to the story, you know, we don't have to say that. They're just an expert, like a physicist or somebody who's like an expert in their field, unless it's about like they're about a you know, something going on in the LGBTQ community. So that is also something that we like have talked about this year too. But yeah, those are all really, really insightful responses. Thank you.
Can I ask, do y'all have an NLGJA student chapter? Does anybody know?
I don't think so.
No pressure. just wondering. When I was in college, I knew about NLGJA kind of, but I had classmates who were told to not put that on their resumes, and I was wondering if you're still being given the guidance right that you should definitely go work for somebody who's not going to hire you because you are queer. Yeah, it's a really good idea. Just wondered if y'all are still getting that advice.
No, not at all. I would hope nobody would get that advice. Oh my goodness.
I feel like it's like now a thing, you want to hire queer people because you look better. But I don't think newsrooms track that yet, even though they should.
I think the only affinity group journalism, like student group, is NABJ, is the only one that has like an active chapter. I know Xandra, who is on the call, is a part of the NAHJ, but there isn't like an active student presence, I don't think. Cool. Well, does anybody else have any questions for our wonderful guests?
I guess the question I had was, like if you're interviewing a source who's actually like gone through like extreme transphobia or homophobia, like being denied a job just, because they're gay or trans, how do you go about like interviewing them in a way that you tell a story that like needs to be told, but you don't add more harm to the experience?
you want me to take this, Karen? Is that what? Okay. Um, that's a really good question. And I think that's really tricky. I think that for me, I let them guide the conversation a lot, and you know, ask them as much as they're comfortable with, and ask really simple questions. And you know, if there are pieces that a person doesn't want to talk to, I honor that, and let them open up in their own time. And then also honor the fact that I do have to do a story, and that um, there are certain things that I do need to confirm and check, and talk through that with them. I think the old sort of rules of reporting state like you have to maintain like a lot of distance and just be like really um I don't far from the subject. And I agree that you have to be like super like professional. But am also not opposed to like talking through something with the subject to just let them know like what they're signing up for. And I think that's fair and responsible. And so like if I'm going to do a story, for example, with someone who's like um experienced like really intense job discrimination and doesn't know if they want to come forward and doesn't know the rules of reporting, like what is on the record, what is off the record, what does on background mean, what does it mean if their name was in the paper, what could that look like. I'll talk through all of that with them before they make the decision to go on, and I'll say, look, um I'm not trying to like create a situation to convince you to tell me everything and like get you to open up to me. I'm not trying to trick you. So like if you say something and later like that feels bad for you, that's okay. Like we can take that back. And I'll do that with a normal person where I won't do that with like a politician, because this is that person's life. It could change their life in a really dramatic and serious way. Um, and I'm not out to ruin someone's life who's experienced trauma or harm. And to me, that is fair reporting and it's responsible reporting. And I won't grant that to like, you know, a politician or a CEO who I'm going after. But for a human who's like going through trauma and trying to figure out and navigate a story, like um, that you have to be really careful, I think, and talk through that with them, and let them slow down and take the time they need to tell their story. And sometimes if they've told me something and I feel like I'm not sure that they really want this out, I'll even go back to them and say, "Hey, you told me this. It was on the record. Is this a comfortable thing for you?" And I feel totally okay about that. Well, just crickets. All right.
Oh, Natalie, go ahead.
Since you two talked about like stories that don't only focus on like when there's a like legislation targeting a group of people or like crime, do you have examples of stories that you've worked on or that your publication has put out there's like a really good example of like finding those stories and like uplifting and celebrating the LGBTQ community in like times that aren't like where they're facing pain and trauma?
I'll give one example. We have a reporter. Thank you for that question. This is an imperfect example, but we have a reporter right now working on a story about it's the 30th anniversary of the Leather Archives and Museum in Chicago. Right, I know. So yeah, Adam is a social justice reporting fellow for us, who is a trans journalist, and is working on a story about the 30th anniversary of the Leather Archives. And like, I mean, getting paid to go to the Leather Archives and Museum, I would say is pretty, it doesn't suck as an assignment. So I feel like that kind of like a lifestyle story, or, you know, there's so many different parts of, I know Adam is amazing. I love Adam. We're hoping to keep them. So yeah, I just feel like if you think about all of the different kinds of stories there are to write about people. I feel like we forget, we just reduce people on the margins to these like caricatures, like we just become like outlines of people, but we are whole people with whole lives doing whole things. And if you just think through like all of the different ways that we're interacting with culture and so many different things, I feel like that I think is a good guide to doing stories that aren't just about when something terrible is happening.
Thank you all so
Yes,
much.
but I'm gonna say thank you so much for coming and speaking to us. Like it's always interesting. I get my little Zoom bubble and I talk to my same amount of people, and then it's like, let's talk to actual experts.
Absolutely, thank y'all. And if you're not sick of seeing me and you want to meet Tracy Bame, I am on another NLGJA panel tonight at 7 through the Chicago chapter organized by Adam. It will be me, Tracy Bame, and Derek Clifton, who is another queer journalist in Chicago. You can find that on Twitter. But thank y'all so much. This was great. Kate, it was so
Thank
good to meet you.
So good to meet you. Bye.
Thank you all so much. And we do have the recording and we'll post it online afterwards. So thank you all again so much. And thank you to our wonderful guests for your time.